Good morning, Mr. Kausikan. I'm Caleb, Secretary General for YMAX Conference 2022. It is our pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for coming. The theme for this year's conference is Futuring New Possibilities. So throughout the past few years, uncertainty and disruption have been a staple for the globe. In Southeast Asia, trade, travel, social activity, and regional diplomatic events have ground to a halt in the midst of the global health crisis. So as ASEAN slowly emerges from the spectre of the pandemic, the time is right for them to forge new paths in areas ranging from energy to education, piracy to cybersecurity, and much more. So we hope that Mr. Kausikan could share with us today his perspectives on the future of ASEAN and the role of youth in understanding and appreciating this regional mechanism to ensure security and stability in the Indo-Pacific for years to come. So Mr. Bilahari Kausikan is currently chairman of the Middle East Institute, an autonomous institute of the National University of Singapore. He has spent his entire career in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. During his 37 years in the ministry, he served in a variety of appointments at home and abroad, including as ambassador to the Russian Federation, permanent representative to the United Nations in New York, and as permanent secretary to the ministry. So let us now invite Mr. Kausikan to give his introductory remarks.
Well, once again, thank you for inviting me. I'm very sorry I can't be here in person, but I guess this is better than nothing. Well, I think before we get into a discussion of what ASEAN can do in the future, I think it's very important for us to start from a baseline of where ASEAN has come from and what its fundamental purposes are, because those purposes are still valid. And if you don't understand what ASEAN has done well, can do well, but equally, because no organization can do everything equally well, what it cannot do, right? Then you will end up, with a very distorted perspective of ASEAN. I mean, quite a lot of criticism of ASEAN, and some of it is really justified. But as I have said on many occasions, it's utterly pointless to criticize a horse, a cow maybe, for being an imperfect horse. A cow is a cow and a horse is a horse. And a cow will never be a horse and vice versa. And a lot of criticism of ASEAN amounts to criticizing a cow for being an imperfect horse. I think there are two fundamental points about ASEAN that I want to make in these opening remarks before we get into a conversation that I think you should always bear in mind. First of all, you have to be realistic about ASEAN. ASEAN is not a happy band of brothers always singing in perfect harmony. If we were indeed a happy band of brothers always singing in perfect harmony, there would be no need for ASEAN. It is precisely because stable relations between members of ASEAN cannot be taken for granted. It is precisely because there will be constant misunderstandings, constant differences of interest, that there is a need for ASEAN. And that is ASEAN's fundamental purpose. That is to manage relations between its members, amongst its members. And that is its continuing fundamental purpose. Because don't forget, one of the basic characteristics of Southeast Asia is its diversity. And there are obvious diversities of differences in levels of economic development, differences in different types of political systems, but those are what I would call superficial diversities. Because in principle, at least, levels of economic development can equalize. I'm not saying they will anytime soon, but in principle, they could. Right? And again, in principle, different kinds of political systems can converge. Again, I'm not saying that they will, or anytime soon, or ever, but in principle, again, you can have convergence between different types of political systems. But the diversities of Southeast Asia are far more fundamental and primordial. They are of race, of language, of religion. And it's not so easy to imagine those things ever disappearing. So you always need some kind of mechanism, if not ASEAN, something like it, to manage differences among its members, so that those inevitable differences do not become conflict. You're all quite young, the people here, so you have no personal memory of it. But you just think of what Southeast Asia was like in 1965. I choose 1965 because that's obviously the year Singapore became independent. And it's 2 years before ASEAN was formed in 1967. Just imagine what Southeast Asia was like in 1965. In 1965, Indonesia was fighting an undeclared war against Malaysia that started in 1963. And after 1965, when we were separated from Malaysia, against Malaysia and Singapore. Right? And that war did not end until towards the end of 1966, a few months before ASEAN was formed. But when ASEAN was formed, wars don't end overnight. Even if they formally end, the bitterness, the distrust, the suspicion is there. In 1965, the Philippines was claiming a very large chunk of Malaysia, to wit, Sabah. And it was an active claim. It wasn't just a formal claim, which, the formal claim still exists, but there is nobody in the Philippines who really is serious about it anymore. In 1965, Singapore had just been separated, a polite word for saying kicked out from Malaysia. And, obviously, relations between Singapore and Malaysia were quite fraught. Fraught with racial tension, because that was the fundamental reason for why we could not remain in Malaysia. And there were irredentist movements between southern Thailand and the northern part of West Malaysia, between the southern part of Philippines and the eastern reaches of Indonesia. And of course, on the mainland of Southeast Asia, the Cold War was quite hot in Indochina. Vietnam War was ongoing, had spilled over into Cambodia and Laos. In other words, Southeast Asia, 2 years before ASEAN was formed, was in a damn mess. Today, we still have problems. There is no region in the world that is without problems, but the problems are quite minor compared to what it was, I've just described to you, and quite minor compared to other regions, including very developed regions like Europe, where, as you know, there is an ongoing war in the Ukraine, in the heart of Europe. Right? And I think this is not to be predicted, this peaceful state of Southeast Asia. I said there are problems. There's no region without problems. But by and large, the region is at peace with itself, with each other. And it has developed and grown economically. This was not to be anticipated given the state of Southeast Asia in 1965. So, in that fundamental purpose of managing relations between its members, ASEAN has done pretty well. The second basic point you have to remember about ASEAN is that it is not an autonomous reality. It does not exist in and of itself. What do I mean by this? I mean that ASEAN is an interstate organization. It consists of 10 separate states, which remain separate even though we belong to a common organization. And that's not unusual. That's the same thing you can say of the UN, you can say of the African Union, you can say of SAARC and Southeast Asia. You can say almost of every regional organization except to some degree the EU, which tries to be a supranational organization. But that supranational aspect of the EU, we can talk about it if you like, is one of the problems the EU has. And it's actually, I think, in my opinion, it is the root cause of the problems. Now, so ASEAN is an interstate organization. Never lose sight of that. And what does that mean? It means that it can do no more than what its members agree it is allowed to do, because each state is sovereign. You put these two facts together with the first fact, that this is a diverse region where stable relations between states of Southeast Asia is not to be taken for granted, and I think you will understand why ASEAN can only work by consensus. It's not a perfect form of decision making. It is a lowest common denominator form of decision making. It means ASEAN cannot do a lot of things. It means ASEAN sometimes reacts rather slowly because it takes time to build consensus among diverse states. But there is no other way, because any other mode of decision making risks even small disagreements escalating quickly into major conflicts. There is another factor of why ASEAN, being an interstate organization in a very diverse region, can only work by consensus. Now, as I said, decision making by consensus is not ideal, but it's the only workable thing that we have. In practice, consensus and its corollary, which is non-interference in each other's affairs, has been modified in practice. In fact, we often modify it in practice. But as a principle, I don't see it being abandoned. There's no other practical way of working. Now, when you have decision making by consensus in an interstate organization, the key variable about how quickly consensus can be reached or what kind of consensus, whether it's a superficial consensus, whether it's a deep consensus, is the domestic politics of member states. And I think the hard fact is the domestic politics of some key member states right now is in something of a mess, right? And will probably remain in something of a mess for some years to come. Remember these two things, these two basic factors. That what is ASEAN's basic purpose? It is an interstate organization that can do no more than what its members allow it to do. Now, I'll be happy to take your questions, have a discussion with you.
Okay, yep. Thank you, Mr. Kausikan. Yeah, so I think before we talk about the individual countries, maybe we can talk about generally how ASEAN is still surviving, and maybe you can take some of the questions that our delegates and participants have already submitted.
Okay.
Yeah. So one of the questions I think it gives us a bit more hope is that how can ASEAN remain relevant in the international world order? Because I think in your recent commentary you have written that ASEAN imagines itself at the center of geopolitical competition in Southeast Asia, but it could well find itself on the margins, no longer a major actor in its own arena. So how do you think can ASEAN avoid this?
Well, first of all, I think its fundamental purpose is still relevant. The international environment around us is certainly in a state of flux and is getting more complex. But it would be even more complex if the countries of ASEAN were at each other's throats. There would be much more instability, potential or actual, if there was not this mechanism for stabilizing relations among its members. Now, that said, that's the fundamental purpose, right? You can't rest, and the achievement of ASEAN in that fundamental purpose has been considerable. But you can't rest on your laurels. It's going to be difficult to do new things for the reasons I just mentioned, the second of the reasons anyway. Yes. But that doesn't mean it's impossible, and it certainly doesn't mean you shouldn't try, right? Because you are not going to remain central by merely repeating over and over again as if it was some kind of magic spell, I'm central, I'm central, I'm central. You are not even going to remain central just because your partners, out of diplomatic politeness, if nothing else, say, yes, you're central, don't worry. All right? Do they really mean it? Some do, some don't. And to what extent do they mean it? You have to do things. Now, the central issue of our time is the strategic competition between the US and China. I don't think ASEAN needs to do everything either of these countries would like you to do. Both the US and China say over and over again that they don't want ASEAN to have to choose. They lie. They do want ASEAN to have to choose. But ASEAN does not have to choose. Whatever we do, we have to bear in mind we are doing in our own interests. Bearing in mind what is our interest is going to take, because of the reasons I mentioned, more effort to arrive at a common definition of our interest. But it's not impossible. We have to try. I think a certain degree of complacency, because of past achievements, has crept into ASEAN circles. There is even a certain degree, what I would call, of strategic timidity, a deliberate narrowing of strategic horizons or strategic ambition. Now, this is not because a new generation of ASEAN leaders is necessarily less competent than their predecessors. It's because the political conditions don't forget the second of the points I made in the beginning, has changed. All the ASEAN countries, the politics of all the ASEAN countries is and will continue to become more pluralistic, more complicated. That's even true of the former one-party states like Laos and Vietnam, which are communist countries. But their internal politics has become more complicated, as has Singapore, as has Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, all of them. And it's difficult, much more difficult, for this new generation of ASEAN political leaders, whether they are political leaders or officials, to reach and sustain consensus within their own countries. And if they can't do that, it's obviously going to be more difficult to get a consensus among 10 people, particularly in these new conditions of strategic competition and strategic complexity. But it's not impossible. and you have to try. My criticism of ASEAN under the present condition is, as I said, they have become a little bit complacent. They have lost sight of some of the fundamentals. Difficult as they may be, they have really, in some ways, given up trying, I think. Not everybody will agree with me, but I think so. Or they have not enough ambition in what they are trying to do. You may fail in your ambition, but you will never know until you try.
Okay, so in that case, how should ASEAN actually really try? How can ASEAN get back to not be so complacent and invite the major powers, engage them in the region again?
No, we have done. It's not a question of inviting them to get engaged in the region, They are here whether they like it, you like it or not, right? Southeast Asia is a strategic crossroads. It's the connection between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and has been for centuries, since time immemorial. And strategic crossroads are always the arenas for major power competition. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because that means that there will always be more than one major power interested in your region, engaged in your region. Major power competition is a natural state of affairs in international relations. So you shouldn't get too alarmed by it. You shouldn't certainly get paralyzed by the spectacle of it. It's dangerous. It can be dangerous, but it also creates opportunities.
Okay, yeah. So I think one of the questions about Sino-US relationships will be about US in particular, about why does the US seem like placing a lot of emphasis on military partnerships in the region recently, especially AUKUS, and more so for military partnerships than multilateral economic partnerships, which may be less beneficial to ASEAN?
No, I think first of all, you have to be very realistic about this. The basis of any other kind of cooperation is strategic stability. And strategic stability rests on the foundation of military balance. And the US is the only possible military balance to China. Without the US, there is no balance against China. With no balance against China, the foundation for genuine cooperation as distinct from imposed cooperation is not there. So that US is a vital element of any strategic balance. And that is, I think, better appreciated by all ASEAN countries. It's not always possible for all of them to say so explicitly, mainly for reasons of their domestic politics. But they do recognize it. Now, without that base of military balance, there is no basis, there is no foundation for any kind of cooperation. Your multilateral institutions in the region, whether they're the CP, TPP, or RCEP, or anything else, or APEC, or anything else which may evolve in the future, is not possible without that fundamental foundation. All right? So let's get that straight. Now, the US is going to be, because of the reasons of its domestic politics, is going to find it very difficult to participate in these multilateral economic forums or institutions. Let's not get into the domestic politics, because I can if you want to, but it gets very complicated, okay? And it will take up all our time, right? But just take it for granted, it's not possible. But they have done the second best. They have now announced the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework.
Yes.
Right. It still lacks definition, but it's not unimportant, potentially at least, because it does give the US a say in setting the rules for the future in certain key areas. Supply chain resilience, digital economy, and so on, the 4 or 5 areas which they have announced. It still lacks definition, but it's on the table. All the ASEAN countries except Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia have signed on. It's not just for ASEAN, it is larger than ASEAN, right? But it has great potential. The other point I think you should not forget, because of its domestic politics, the US, for the foreseeable future, is going to find it rather difficult to participate in multilateral economic initiatives. But the US is still a very important economic partner to almost every ASEAN country on a bilateral basis.
Now it seems like there are concerns about Myanmar being within ASEAN, especially reintegrating them, especially after the recent Myanmar coup. So what do you think? How can different ASEAN countries re-engage them? And is there any way to sort things out?
I think ASEAN made a very fundamental mistake with regard to Myanmar. It was not wrong to set certain standards for membership, which is the 5-point consensus, which the ASEAN leaders reached in April last year. But I think it was a fundamental and very stupid mistake to tell Myanmar, you cannot attend our meetings until you fulfill those 5-point consensus. Right? Because look, those 5-point consensus are aspirations. Now, if any Myanmar government was willing to meet all those consensus, release all political prisoners, forswear the use of violence, engage all political forces, there wouldn't have been a coup in the first place. Right? So it's good as an aspiration, but it was stupid and a mistake to exclude Myanmar until they fulfill that, because they won't. They are not going to. That's the hard reality. And if you want to have any influence, you have to talk to them. Now we have excluded them, and we have said something very stupid, particularly stupid, which is that only a non-political representative can represent Myanmar. What the hell does that mean? It's nonsense. Even if Myanmar sends an office boy to attend the meeting, that office boy cannot attend without the consent of the military regime. So he's the representative of the military regime. So we have put ourselves into a corner because of stupidity. Because maybe inexperience or getting too excited. Yeah, we should have certain principles, and those principles are important. But in practical diplomacy, principles have to be tempered with a sense of realism. And now what you have done is really you have given the initiative totally to the military regime. They will do what they want to do without anybody influencing them, because you're not talking to them. If you don't talk to them, how the hell are you going to influence them? Tell me. They are not telepathic, they can't read your mind. Even if they can read your mind, why should they listen to you? Right? The chances of influencing them were also already very slim. But now, because of our mistake, and it's a strategic mistake, I think they are zero. So we got on a high horse without any means of getting off it. So that's where we are, Myanmar. And it's all our own fault, You can't blame anybody else, all right?
It seems like ultimately it still depends on whether the military regime is willing to participate.
Exactly.
Yes.
So you don't have either carrots or sticks to either force them to participate or to induce them to participate, right? So you make yourself even more important.
So we found ourselves in a very hard place.
No, you didn't find yourself. You put yourself in the same hard place because of stupidity.
So I think we have a very interesting question on the Indo-Pacific. So the question is, have you read the book 2034?
I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
Okay, so it talks about a conflict in the South China Sea between America and China because of some naval incursions happening in the near future. So do you think a conflict as depicted in this novel could potentially happen in the foreseeable future?
Look, conflict is always a possibility in international relations. In any system of relationship between sovereign states, you can never discount the possibility of war. However, I do not think it's very high vis-a-vis the South China Sea. The competition in the South China Sea is not going to stop. It is very largely a strategic stalemate. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is nobody is going to make China dig up those artificial islands they have constructed and throw the sand back into the sea. And sooner or later, they will deploy weapon systems on them. But neither can China deter the US and its allies and friends operating in the South China Sea, through the South China Sea, under the South China Sea, and over the South China Sea without risking war. And I don't think China wants to risk war over the South China Sea, because it is not a given that China will win. It is still very far behind. And if I was a PLA general or a Chinese leader, I would be looking very closely at the dismal performance, the incompetent performance of the Russian armed forces in Ukraine. Because I'll be thinking, oh my God, my weapon systems are the same. They are based on the same kinds of weapon systems. Even my doctrine is largely similar. And I have had no experience of war since 1979, and it didn't end very well for me, China, when they fought against Vietnam, a much smaller country. All right, so I don't think they are eager to go to war, either side. And in the South China Sea, the pattern of competition is very largely ritualized. The risk of war is highest in the Taiwan Straits, because that's a very different kind of issue, where China will find it very difficult to compromise. And the Chinese government has spent the last 10, 15, 20 years stirring up their own people about Taiwan. Now imagine if there's an accident in the South China Sea. let's say a collision of a plane and a Chinese pilot is killed. I think they can and they will try their best to calm things down. It won't escalate. It's not the same situation in the Taiwan Straits, all right? Because it's a much more emotional issue, and even if the Chinese government does not want to escalate, they will find it difficult to control their own public opinion. So that is the danger. But overall, I don't think the risk of war between the US and China is very high. It's not zero, because it's never zero in international relations, but it's not very high. And the reason for that is a simple one. It's nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence has kept the peace between nuclear powers ever since there are nuclear weapons. No nuclear weapon state has gone directly to war with each other. India and Pakistan had a very bad skirmish, but they both still calmed it down. India and China had a very bad skirmish more recently, but they both decided to calm it down. Simply too dangerous. And for 40 over years, the US and the Soviet Union jostled with each other, at times in much more extreme ways than the US and China is jostling with each other, and they didn't go to war. Nuclear deterrence is a stabilizing factor.
We've talked about China's influence in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits. Maybe looking at the Pacific Island region, do you think China's expansion of influence within the Pacific Island region has unsettled Australia and New Zealand, and whether it can be checked in a way that is satisfying to the Western powers?
Okay, I'll answer that, but before that, I want to make a general point. I think Chinese foreign policy under Xi Jinping has been largely a failure, a complete failure. They botched relations with the US. The US has some responsibility too, but the Chinese drank too much of their own Kool-Aid, believed their own propaganda about the US being in irrevocable and absolute decline, and were surprised when there was pushback, right? And are still trying to adapt, right? I can't think of any country anywhere in the world, including some that are very dependent on China, that has not got some concerns about Chinese behavior. The concerns are not all the same, and they're not all held with the same intensity, but it's very hard to think of a country with no concerns about China, all right? And that's a failure of diplomacy. Who created the Quad? And who created AUKUS? Mr. Xi Jinping. It's not the Americans, it's not the brilliance of American diplomacy that created these things. The American diplomacy has been quite clumsy at times, but it's the failure of Chinese diplomacy that created these things. They have got small tactical success. And the most recent big failure is to go into this so-called no-limits partnership with Russia. That led them into a strategic dead end with no easy exit. So let's get the big picture right. Now, there's no reason I see why the South Pacific Islands should not have a relationship with China. Why shouldn't they? Australia is not very happy, but the bloody Australians have neglected the South Pacific for ages. Right? So why should they be so surprised? Okay, they will react. The US is going to react. And, and that's natural because competition is natural. But I don't see anything particularly strange about the Chinese trying to improve their position in the South Pacific or in any other country or region in the world. That's how major powers behave. Now, if they had made some advance in the South Pacific, well, it's as much due to the neglect of Australia, New Zealand, than their diplomacy, right? So I don't think we should get too excited. I mean, we in Singapore or we in ASEAN should get too excited about that. I can see why the Australians are getting a bit excited, but it's their own damn fault.
So like ASEAN states, the South Pacific Island nations also have the agency to make the choice as well.
Yeah, of course they have made a choice, and they made a choice. By the way, somebody very cruel once said, it's cruel, but it's not entirely untrue. I can say it because now I'm retired, You never buy these states, you only rent them. So we'll see. This is not the end of the story yet, okay?
So things will change.
They will always change. Things are always changing.
So I think we've roughly covered the idea of ASEAN and in the Indo-Pacific region, the political situation there. Maybe we can talk more about youth understanding of ASEAN now. Do you think that the way youth consume social media has also affected their views and the way they digest
That's another issue. That is something to be of concern. Because I don't believe many people these days, unless you are a student and have to read books or articles or newspapers. Most people in every country, it is not unique to Singapore or Southeast Asia, and it's not confined to youth either, all right? Most people, main source of information on any damn thing is social media or the internet, generally speaking, and that is a little disturbing. Because there's a lot of good stuff on the internet, but there's a whole lot more of rubbish.
We need to filter through the rubbish.
You need to have a critical sense. So the problem is not the internet or social media per se. It is cultivating the critical sense. And cultivating the critical sense means taking some trouble to acquire information. Now, one problem with the internet and social media in particular, it has broken down the distinction between information and opinion, and between both and entertainment. There is a difference between fact and opinion. You can get a lot of good facts and good stuff on the internet, but you have to exercise that critical sense. And that is being eroded, not just by youth, but for everybody on the internet.
Okay, so I think that really marks the end of this conversation. I think it's really been very fruitful and meaningful, getting more insights about ASEAN, the Indo-Pacific region, as well as what youths can do to better understand and appreciate the ASEAN region. So hopefully that youths can appreciate and thank Mr. Kausikan for his time here in this
Well,
session.
you can thank me by doing one thing. If you hear your elders and so-called betters talking rubbish, tell them so.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kausikan.
Oh, you're most welcome.